Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Harper. I'm a senior at Elon University, and I'm going to be presenting the research that I conducted this past summer at Elon's summer undergraduate research experience entitled Spatial Analysis of Native Invasive Hybrid Zones. So currently, one of the most pressing issues in conservation is the impact of invasive species on global biodiversity. A species is considered introduced if it is able to establish a permanent population in the region they are invading, and then it is considered invasive if once it has established its permanent population, it has a significant negative ecological or economic impact on the region that it is invading. These invasive species are mostly considered problematic because of their potential to negatively impact the native species of the region they are invading. And in extreme cases, they can cause extinction of the native species through predation, competition, and habitat modification. So the map that you see here shows the global invasion threat for the 21st century, published in 2016. So under my interpretation, you can see that the rates of invasion are extremely prevalent in the United States and in Europe, and along coastal areas, as shown by the red, which shows very high invasion threats. But as you can all see, this is a problem that is occurring globally. Due to the increase in certain human activities and other outside influences, invasion rates are going to increase globally at an exponential rate. And with this, several conservation implications need to be considered, such as the potential for these invasive species to breed with the native species. And with this, another important factor needs to be considered, and that is the potential for hybridization. So what is hybridization? Hybridization basically involves the interbreeding of individuals from two genetically distinct populations. So up here I have a few examples, such as the zebra and the horse, polar bear and grizzly bear, as well as the lion and the tiger. A lot of these are actually occurring in captivity, such as in zoos, but unlike what most people learn in high school biology, hybridization is actually relatively common in nature and happens very naturally, and it often produces viable fertile offspring. In fact, 10% of animal species and 25% of plant species will have offspring with another species, at least occasionally. However, hybridization can also lead to the extinction of native species, as I've mentioned, through this process called genetic swamping. Genetic swamping is basically where the native species is replaced with the hybrids, or in other words, this hybridization can dilute or genetically assimilate the native genotype, completely wiping out the native species with its original genetic makeup. So the potential for invasive species to hybridize with native species is increasing exponentially due to anthropogenic or human-based causes. The two main human activities that are contributing to this include the translocation of organisms and habitat modification. Both of these things are just allowing for the greater dispersal of these exotic or non-indigenous species. However, oftentimes this is unintentional by humans, as species can latch onto ships or shipping crates and translocate that way. But they can also be brought in intentionally by humans as exotic pets or as an introduced form of pest control. So once this hybridization between invasive and native species occurs, several different things can happen. The first thing, which is most often put hand in hand with hybridization in the literature, is called introgression, and that is basically the transfer of genetic information between two different species. This doesn't always result from hybridization, but its effects can be devastating to the native species, especially when fertile offspring result. As I mentioned earlier, this can lead to genetic swamping, which is that process of genetic assimilation of the native genotype to the hybridizing species. So in extreme cases, the hybridization with this added introgression can lead to extinction as the native genotype is diluted past the point of recovery. So all of these things don't necessarily have to happen in this order or have to happen at all or together, but each one is definitely causing concern for conservationists. So one of the most popular pieces of hybridization literature called Extinction by Hybridization and Introgression by Judith Reimer and Daniel Simberloff is basically what sparked my research here. This is a conceptual, theoretical paper that emphasizes the fact that nobody's really looking at hybridization as a conservation threat. This paper basically compiled case studies of flora and fauna hybridizations and the resulting introgressions that have occurred globally. However, this paper did not perform any spatial analysis or really draw any big trends. They just kind of pointed out the conservation concern at hand. This is basically where my research came in, so I wanted to incorporate geographical elements into this popular piece of literature and look for spatial patterns in the case studies from the paper. So based on my previous knowledge of invasive species and the literature that I had reviewed, I was able to make a few predictions. So I predicted that the species invasions would be more concentrated around the subtropics and along the ports, as these are common points of entry from human travel, as I showed in the map before. I also predicted that they would be more common in the United States, Europe, and Australia, because this is really where invasive species have been done for the most part and where they are seen to be concentrated. So just as an overview of my methods, I used the Reimer and Simberloff study really as a jumping off point for my research, but had to get all of the data by my own means, as this paper didn't really offer any data to me. So I found it through available museum data, and with this data, my goal was to provide a visual element to this classic piece of literature in order to analyze the spatial data for conservation education purposes and to aid in conservation efforts through my GIS maps. So to start, I identified all of the relevant pairs of invading native hybridizing species from the Reimer and Simberloff paper. I listed all of the pairs mentioned in the paper and chose the species pairs with available data. I found when trying to find the data that a lot of species had not already been assessed, so it was really easy to narrow down which species I would be analyzing. So for my data, I mainly looked on IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, to see if the species had been assessed. And if they had been, I would download the spatial data for both species in the hybrid pair. I would then get my point data from GBIF, which is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, to translate this data onto Arcmap. So most of this data is compiled from museum data collection, which is open and available to the public, and turned out to be a great resource for my research. So this is basically just to emphasize the tedious nature of the downloading process of data. This is my spreadsheet, and I wasn't able to get all of it onto the slide. But these are basically just me listing all of the different species pairs. As you can see in the first two columns on the left, those are the two hybridizing pairs. I also analyzed their invasive and native ranges, where they are in the literature, what journal, etc., as well as their conservation status, so whether or not they are endangered, threatened, anything like that. So this was definitely very time-intensive, time-consuming, but it was worth it, obviously. So once I had all this point data and all of the data was downloaded, and I added it to Arcmap on top of a global base layer, I had more of a visual element to kind of analyze the data for clusters or hotspots. So I used these observed clusters to create a raster layer of hotspots of species hybridizations. So I also was able to research the native range of both the invasive and native species to see how it matched up with the point data, and for the most part, I found that it was relatively consistent. So once I had all of this point data on top of a global base layer, I exported the individual species as shapefiles from the point data and selected the species points that were occurring in the hybrid zones. Once I had those points selected, I was able to export these points as another shapefile. From here, I used the convex hole tool to create a polygon around these points in the hybrid zone. The reason why I chose the convex hole tool is because they are often used as a way to represent a range of observed points or an estimate of their outer range. So this ended up being the perfect tool to create the polygons. So I ended up with about 10 polygons showing the hybrid zones of 10 different species pairs, which I will show you in a minute. So the maps that I ended up generating with these 10 polygons show that hybridization between native and invasive species is occurring across the globe and across diverse taxa, with no real pattern of where they're occurring and how often. So some of my predictions here were correct, that several of the hybridization hotspots occurring along the coasts and ports were definitely significant, as well as in Europe and the United States. However, I did find a lot of hybridizations occurring inland, and not as many in Australia where I had predicted and where a lot of the hybridization research is occurring. But I did find a fair number of species hybridizing in Africa, which I found to be interesting. So these are the 3 maps that I generated, and as you can see, they have the 10 polygons spread worldwide, and I also have the 2 hybridizing species pairs represented in the polygons. So from my interpretation, this just indicates that this work needs to be expanded with continued research from future case studies, as well as an extension of the available museum data to the public so that this research can continue. I'm hopeful that my maps will be used to analyze patterns in latitude, ecoregion, and proximity to the coast or human population centers in future work. So because of my research, I would argue that this work is very important for the future of species conservation efforts. Due to the exponentially increasing rates of hybridization and their resulting introgressions, many vulnerable species are becoming endangered or more endangered, sometimes to the point of extinction. So in order to maintain global biodiversity, more research definitely needs to be done to help prevent the spread of invasive species and the genetic dilution of native species. However, because hybridization is so diverse, which is what my maps showed, it does make conservation management a bit more difficult. However, some practices are currently in place to prevent the decline of biodiversity. So for instance, there is a more thorough inspection of travelers as they exit and enter countries going on. So I experienced this as I was exiting New Zealand and going into Australia. They really made sure to clean my hiking boots to make sure that there weren't any hitchhikers coming along with me and that I wasn't bringing any invasive species into the next country. So it's definitely becoming more thorough. They're also thoroughly checking ships as they enter ports for non-Indigenous hitchhikers as well. So seeing as this major conservation concern is mostly human-driven by those anthropogenic causes, it is our responsibility to do something about it and put more efforts towards conserving native species and preventing future extinctions. And thank you. I'd love to take any questions. Yes. One more time, sorry.
The common name of your 10 species?
Oh, let's see. So I have them listed here. We had a lot of ducks and fish, as well as a lot of cats and wolves. The gray wolf and the red wolf was definitely a common hybridizing pair, as well as some pigeons in the outer islands. And we have 2 hybridizing owl species along the coast in California. But a lot of my research was the duck and the fish that is down there. They were most common. Yeah. Yes, definitely. So a lot of the species that I was analyzing, as you can see on this spreadsheet here, at least all of the ones that are highlighted are endangered and have definitely severe potential for extinction because of these hybridizations. So because they are hybridizing, their genotype is being diluted, and that's causing them to become more endangered with time. Yes. Not yet. Great. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.